There was a time when millions of people did something no generation had ever done before. They took the most intimate code in their body, sealed it in a plastic tube, and mailed it to a Silicon Valley startup that still didn't really know how it would make money. Not search history, not social media, their DNA. 23andMe became the most invasive data harvesting project in consumer tech history, not by hacking computers, but by charming families at kitchen tables, holiday sales, cute ads, discounted spit kits. Behind every tube was a genome, behind every genome was a life, and behind every life was a network of parents, children, cousins, and unborn relatives who had never clicked accept on anything. DNA is not a browser cookie that can be cleared. It is permanent. It cannot be changed, reset, or logged out. It reveals ancestry, disease risk, biological sex, hidden siblings, even the likelihood of future children inheriting lethal conditions. When that kind of data is copied, breached, or quietly traded, the damage does not stop with one customer. It ripples through an entire family tree. Publicly, 23andMe promised to democratize genetics, to give ordinary people the power to read their own code and take control of their health. The story sounded at times inspiring and at times chilling, a Silicon Valley crusade to break medicine open and an invitation to hand over humanity's source code for a discount on a holiday gift bundle. While the marketing spoke about empowerment, inside the company boardrooms the real question was more blunt. How does this empire of spit ever turn into profit? Because behind the mission language sat a quieter reality. Massive pharma partnerships, exclusive data deals, a business model built on uncertainty, where the only thing growing faster than the genetic database was the pile of investor money being burned to build it. It is an example of what happens when the drive for power over data races ahead of any clear plan for how that power will be used. Investors hailed 23andMe as the Google of your genome. The comparison sounded perfect. Google indexed the world's information and turned it into an unstoppable ad engine that printed money. 23andMe would index human DNA and somehow do the same. The problem was simple and ruthless. Google had search ads. 23andMe had spit kits, regulatory trouble, and a cost structure that made every new customer feel like another bet that the real business would finally appear. So let me take you back to the beginning of this story. From the idealistic founding and Silicon Valley hype, through the moment the FDA cracked down and exposed how fragile the plan really was, to the desperate pivot towards selling data, the layoffs, the data breaches, and the uncomfortable question hanging over the future of consumer biotech. When a company holds your code before it holds a business model, who is really in control? To understand how 23andMe ended up holding millions of people's DNA without a clear business model, let me take you back to a very specific moment in time. Mid-2000s Silicon Valley, when the air itself felt monetized, and every party in Palo Alto sounded like a pitch deck with better lighting. There was a time when Google felt less like a company and more like a rising empire. Search was printing money, Web 2.0 optimism was everywhere, and the culture believed software could rewrite every industry. Media, taxis, banking, dating, and now the most intimate code of all, biology. If you could tag photos on Facebook, why not tag genetic variants in your genome and turn medicine into a dashboard? Into this world stepped Anne Wojcicki. She didn't come from a lab bench, she came from Wall Street. As a healthcare analyst, she spent years watching insurance companies, hospitals, and drug makers burn through money while patients stayed sick. The system looked bloated, slow, and in her view, ripe for a ruthless software-style disruption. Her life was already orbiting power. Her sister Susan rented a garage to the Google founders. Anne married Sergey Brin himself. That connection mattered. not just socially, but financially. When your family dinners include the people who turn search queries into a trillion-dollar machine, your sense of what's too ambitious changes very quickly. Anne's story is one of rebellion against that old medical order. Instead of more billing codes and gatekeeping, she wanted ordinary people to hold their own genetic data the way they held email or bank apps. To pull that off, she teamed up with Linda Avey, a business development veteran obsessed with genomics, and Paul Cosenza, who brought operational and finance experience. 3 very different careers, one shared thesis. Genetics shouldn't live only in academic journals and hospital basements. It should go straight from the lab to the living room. Their original vision was disarmingly simple: a mail-in spit kit that arrived like an online shopping order. You drooled in a tube, sent it back, and a few weeks later, a sleek web dashboard appeared. Ancestry stories that told you where your family came from. Health risk reports that turned complex genomics into color-coded charts and tidy explanations. It felt less like medical infrastructure and more like a lifestyle upgrade, the way a fitness tracker gamifies your steps while quietly collecting everything about your body. On the surface, it was at times inspiring and at times chilling. Inspiring because people who'd never seen a medical specialist could suddenly explore their DNA on a laptop. Chilling because no one paused too long on what it meant for a private company to sit on that pile of data. With early funding from Google, backing from its co-founders, and access to a social circle drunk on disruption, 23andMe launched with a runway that looked almost limitless. Yet underneath the champagne and TED-ready mission, one brutal question was already forming in the shadows. What if this beautiful vision had no sustainable way to pay for itself? There was a time when spitting in a tube for $999 was marketed as the future of human identity. Not a hospital procedure, not a clinical emergency, but a luxury purchase. The kind of thing a tech executive might unwrap at a holiday party and brag about between sips of champagne. Let me take you back to 2007. 23andMe rolls out its first product, a sleek white box, a saliva kit that promised to decode your ancestry, your health risks, even your quirks in one frictionless experience. The price tag alone signaled exclusivity. This was not designed for families scraping by in poverty. It was aimed at the early adopters, the bloggers, the venture capitalists, the people who loved being first in line for whatever looked most like tomorrow. The pitch was seductive. For less than the cost of a high-end iPhone at the time, you could own a glimpse of your genetic destiny. No referrals, no waiting rooms, no awkward conversations with a doctor. You ordered online, spit at home, mailed it back, and a few weeks later, a dashboard appeared on your laptop, quietly whispering, "Here is your life," written in code. It turned something ancient and clinical into a consumer ritual. That was the disruption. 23andMe didn't want to be a medical vendor begging insurers for reimbursement. It wanted to be a consumer brand, a kind of Apple for DNA, where the genome was an app and your body was the platform. Investors in Silicon Valley were thrilled. Direct-to-consumer meant scale, virality, data flowing in without the gatekeeping of hospitals or regulators. It's an example of what happens when a scientific tool is dressed up as lifestyle technology and sold as empowerment. But behind the glossy story, the money math was already uneasy. Running those tests required expensive genotyping chips, certified labs, cold chain logistics, customer support, and constantly updated software. Each kit brought in revenue, yes, but after paying for the science, the shipping, and the endless hand-holding for confused customers, the margins were thin. Every sale gave 23andMe more genetic data, more power for the future, yet not much profit in the present. The media didn't dwell on that. Time magazine named the service Invention of the Year. Breathless profiles talked about owning your genome. And glossy spreads showed smiling users discovering they were 3% this or 12% that, as if identity could be rounded to the nearest decimal. The narrative was at times inspiring and at times chilling, promising liberation through knowledge while quietly ignoring the question of how this empire of spit would ever sustain itself. Because buried inside every early kit was something more valuable than the test itself, a growing, linked database of human DNA. Investors finally began to whisper about it. Maybe the real product wasn't the report on your screen at all. Maybe the real product was the massive genomic archive being built in the background, an asset they hoped one day would be worth far more than any nine box. Because when you're sitting on a growing vault of human DNA, the next question is obvious. Who is going to pay for all this? For 23andMe, the early answer was simple: Google. There was a time when the company didn't look like a fragile consumer startup at all. It looked like a chosen project of Silicon Valley royalty. Anne Wojcicki was married to Google co-founder Sergey Brin. Her sister ran YouTube and the search giant itself, along with Brin and Larry Page personally, poured in millions. Top-tier venture firms followed, not treating 23andMe as a mail-order testing shop, but as a once-in-a-generation platform play, the genetic equivalent of building Google in 1998 or Facebook in 2005. Let me take you back to that mindset. To those investors, the spit kits were just the on-ramp. The fantasy was the platform underneath, a living, expanding map of human genomes linked to health records, behaviors, and eventually medical outcomes. From that map, they imagined personalized medicine at scale, drug discovery pipelines fed by real-world data, even insurers pricing risk with scientific precision. Losses today were irrelevant. The prize was an empire of biology tomorrow. Cheap capital turned that dream into marching orders. With Google money and VC money and more money on top of that, 23andMe slashed kit prices, ran aggressive holiday campaigns, and treated every new customer as a long-term asset rather than a one-time sale. The company spent heavily on genotyping, cloud storage, and user experience, not because the math worked on each box, but because the more DNA they captured, the more powerful the dataset became. Revenue per kit was negotiable. Growth was non-negotiable. It's an example of what happens when optimism is free and interest rates are low. The culture tilted toward speed, toward frictionless onboarding, toward saying yes. Regulatory questions were treated like obstacles to be managed, not hard walls. If a feature made the product more viral or the story more exciting, it moved forward. If it made the unit economics worse, that was a problem for another quarter, another funding round, another life. Inside the company, a quiet tension grew. Was 23andMe a friendly consumer brand that happened to have a valuable dataset on the side, or was it a data company wearing a friendly consumer mask because that was the cheapest way to collect DNA at scale? The marketing spoke the language of family, identity, and curiosity. The investor deck spoke the language of cohorts, phenotypes, and pharmaceutical partnerships. Both were true. Both could not be equally true forever. His story is one of a man using ruthless efficiency to build a monopoly. This story is one of a company using infinite optimism to chase an undefined future. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the ambiguity worked as long as the money kept flowing and no one forced a choice. But regulators were watching the same ads, reading the same promises, and they had a much simpler question. Was this colorful little tube in your mailbox a medical device or just a toy? The moment they demanded an answer, the vibes stopped being enough. To the FDA, the vibes were never the point. This little plastic tube wasn't just a fun mail-order toy, it was quietly turning into a medical device that could alter the course of someone's life. There was a time when 23andMe's ads were promising to flag your risk for cancer, heart disease, even how you might respond to certain drugs. Not in a clinic, not through a doctor, just through a website and a credit card. That's exactly why regulators cared. If a lab tells you that you carry a BRCA mutation, that's the kind of sentence that can end in a double mastectomy. If a report says your clotting risk is low, that might convince someone to skip blood thinners. The FDA looked at those health risk reports and saw a device that could push people toward surgeries, medications, or dangerous complacency, all without the slow, documented safeguards of traditional medicine. It's an example of what happens when Silicon Valley wanders into a world where move fast and break things translates to move fast and break people. So let me take you back to the early years of that collision. Behind the glossy marketing, there were long, increasingly tense letters and meetings. The FDA kept asking for the same things: validation data showing that each genetic marker actually meant what the website claimed, accuracy studies proving the lab could read those markers reliably, and human factors research showing that ordinary people could understand the risk charts without panicking, or worse, shrugging off real danger. In other words, don't just tell a story about empowerment, prove the numbers. 23andMe answered, but it answered like a tech company. New reports were added, risk scores were redesigned, the website changed constantly. Features launched to the public while the validation packages were still incomplete or still being updated. The company wanted to iterate in production, to learn from millions of customers in real time, while the FDA came from a culture where you lock the design, test it to death, and only then touch a single patient. The gap wasn't just bureaucratic, it was philosophical power versus caution, speed versus certainty. On one side stood a company arguing that people had a right to their own genetic information, that withholding it was paternalistic, even cruel. On the other side, regulators pointed to worst-case scenarios: a false negative that delays a colonoscopy, a false positive that triggers an unnecessary surgery, a misleading drug response report that nudges someone toward the wrong pill. His story is one of medical history creeping into the living room, at times inspiring and at times chilling, because the same data that builds an empire of knowledge can also quietly mislead a single frightened family. By 2013, the FDA's patience was nearly gone. Years of requests had piled up, deadlines slipped, and yet 23andMe was still rolling out new health features, still buying TV ads, still talking about democratizing genetics as if the green light were guaranteed. The agency had watched enough. The next move would not be another polite letter. It would be a public crackdown that finally tested whether this business had real foundations or just a mountain of spit and a beautiful story. The crackdown arrived on a Friday afternoon. On November 22nd, 2013, the headlines hit like a lab door slamming shut. The FDA had ordered 23andMe to stop marketing its health-related genetic tests in the United States. Not later. Not after a quiet meeting. Now, news sites that had once praised the company's bold vision were suddenly running the same phrase over and over: unapproved medical device. The future of personal genomics, the glossy, at-home gateway to your own DNA, had just been tagged by the government as a product that wasn't allowed to be sold as advertised. Let me take you back to what that letter actually said, because the words were more than regulatory jargon. They were a public indictment of the entire business. After years of back and forth, the FDA accused 23andMe of failing to provide sufficient evidence that its health reports were accurate and clinically valid. Despite repeated requests, promised studies had not materialized, timelines had slipped, communication had gone dark. Yet the company was still selling risk reports for cancer, heart disease, drug response, all packaged as if the science and oversight were settled. To the agency, that wasn't innovation. That was an unapproved medical device being sold at scale. Because of that accusation, the consequences were immediate and brutal. 23andMe did not get a gentle warning with a long grace period. Overnight, it was forced to strip health risk reports from its US product. The famous dashboard that once claimed to decode your cancer risk, your likelihood of diabetes, your response to blood thinners, went quiet. What remained was mostly an ancestry-only service, where your family came from, which regions of the world your DNA resembled, maybe a cousin match or two. Interesting, even fun at parties, but a long way from the life-changing medical insight people had been promised for their money. There was a time when ancestry alone could have been a charming little business. But this company had taken hundreds of millions in venture capital, hired aggressively, and told investors it would build an empire on health data. Without those health insights, the consumer story weakened overnight. Growth slowed. The viral buzz around learn your risk for Alzheimer's from your living room evaporated, replaced by find out if you're 2% Scandinavian. It's an example of what happens when the marketing vision races ahead of the regulatory reality. Suddenly, the numbers stopped making sense. Selling spit kits at a discount, paying lab costs, running massive servers, handling customer support, all to deliver ancestry report that competitors could copy, was not a path to real wealth or power. The dream of printing money from endless new customers started to look more like a treadmill, fast and exhausting, with no profit at the end. And yet, even as the health product was crippled, one asset remained untouched. In freezers and databases, 23andMe still held the DNA of millions of people, linked to their health surveys, their family histories, their lives. If the original plan had been shut down and the company was bleeding cash, what do you do when you're sitting on that kind of genetic goldmine? There was a time when 23andMe's homepage looked like a medical revolution wrapped in pastel colors. Risk reports, drug response, carrier status, the promise of peeking into the future of your own body from a living room couch. Overnight, that future disappeared. When the FDA letter hit, the health product went dark, and the company's public face had to change with it. The same website that once teased cancer risk and heart disease suddenly leaned into ancestry maps, Neanderthal percentages, and fun traits about cilantro hatred or earwax type. The copy shifted from learn about your health to learn about your story, from clinical confidence to family reunion energy. It was still the same saliva tube, the same lab, the same empire of data growing in the background, but the marketing now insisted this was all just entertainment, a harmless exploration of heritage and quirky genetics. Inside the company, that pivot landed like a psychological whiplash. Engineers and scientists who had joined to transform medicine now watched their algorithms and reports relabeled as unapproved, potentially dangerous, even illegal to sell. Years of validation work were suddenly treated as if they were snake oil. For people who had left stable careers to chase this mission, it felt less like a product tweak and more like an excommunication. His story is one of poverty to wealth. Theirs, at least for a moment, was a slide from world-changing to party trick. Because of that regulatory exile, money stopped moving the way investors expected. Health risk reports had been the emotional hook, the reason a new customer would spend real cash instead of waiting for a holiday sale. Without them, the pitch became ancestry, curiosity, maybe a gift for a relative. Sales slowed. Repeat purchases made no sense. Existing customers who had already paid opened their dashboards to find promised health insights missing, grayed out or delayed indefinitely. Support queues filled with angry emails. Refund requests climbed. The growth curve that had once justified billion-dollar dreams started to flatten, then bend. This is where the survival question moved from subtext to boardroom agenda. Investors had not poured hundreds of millions into a one-time gift business. Kit margins were thin, marketing was expensive, and there was a hard ceiling on how many people wanted to know if their great-grandfather was from County Cork. To reach the multi-billion-dollar outcome that had been quietly assumed from day one, leadership needed something more than holiday promo codes and Ancestry TV commercials. They needed a new engine of power. So attention turned back to that frozen asset, the world-scale database of human lives, linked to surveys, diseases, and family histories. Let me take you back to that image of freezers and servers humming away while the website sold fun traits. It's an example of what happens when the visible product is wounded. The invisible one steps forward. Slowly, then decisively, the real product stopped being the report on your screen and became the raw genetic data beneath it, and there was one industry willing to pay dearly for that. So down in that invisible layer, something enormous was forming. Not a boutique ancestry service, but one of the largest collections of human genetic data in history. More than 12 million people, their DNA decoded, labeled, and quietly stacked in a digital warehouse that never sleeps. This was not just a pile of genomes. Each sample was tied to a real person with a name, an address, a credit card, and a family. There was a time when 23andMe's emails didn't just ask customers to log in, they nudged them to answer surveys. Do you have diabetes? How many cups of coffee do you drink? What drugs do you take? And how do they make you feel? Over time, millions responded, so the company didn't just know the letters in your DNA, it knew your diseases, your diet, your sleep, your vices, and your family tree. That combination is what turned the basement into an empire. A raw genome on a hard drive is useful, but anonymous. A genome linked to a 45-year-old woman with a specific cancer history, a list of medications, a map of relatives, and a log of how often she exercises is something very different. It's an example of what happens when data stops being abstract and starts being a living biography, a compressed version of a life that can be queried, modeled, and sold. To consumers, this did not sound ruthless. The same interface that showed 2% Neanderthal also showed a gentle checkbox. Do you want to participate in research? The language was warm, almost philanthropic. Help advance science. Contribute to curing disease. Be part of something bigger than your family. Opt-in felt like charity, not commerce. Most people clicked yes and moved on, thinking they were giving a small favor to the future. Let me take you back to how that looked from the other side of the glass. To investors and pharmaceutical executives, this was not a charity. This was a potential gold mine. Because millions of genomes linked to health outcomes can reveal which genes drive asthma, which variants raise heart attack risk, which biological pathways might be blocked by a new drug. Algorithms could sweep across the database, finding patterns, building predictive models, turning messy human lives into clean statistical signals that could be patented and monetized. The GlaxoSmithKline deal in 2018 made this explicit, a $300 million partnership, exclusive access to the data for drug discovery, the promise of new medicines born not from lab animals, but from the aggregated bodies of paying customers. His story is one of oil. This story is one of information. at times inspiring and at times chilling in its efficiency. On the surface, the brand still smiled. Learn about your ancestors, find your relatives, maybe discover you like cilantro. But beneath that friendly marketing, the real product was no longer the report on your screen. It was the massive, monetizable biomedical data set humming in the background, growing more powerful with every spit tube and about to pull 23andMe into a very different kind of business. On the surface, this looked like a quirky lifestyle brand. Colorful boxes, friendly fonts, upbeat commercials about knowing yourself and connecting with family. It felt closer to a yoga app than a research lab. But behind that cheerful exterior, the money, the power, the entire empire was drifting somewhere else entirely. Because there was a time when 23andMe really did talk like a classic consumer company, direct-to-consumer DNA, personalized health insights, a little dashboard that made genetics feel playful instead of terrifying. Yet, as the years went on, the business model that actually paid the bills depended less on the report in your inbox and more on licensing giant chunks of your data to institutions you would never meet and never vote on. Let me take you back to the incentives. Investors did not pour hundreds of millions into this company so it could sell novelty ancestry kits at holiday parties. They wanted scale. They wanted defensibility. They wanted a moat. And the moat was not the website. It was the size and richness of the database. More people, more traits, more survey answers, more medical records linked in. Leadership was rewarded for one thing above all else: grow the pile of genomes and attach life details until it became too valuable for pharma, insurers, and researchers to ignore. Once that logic takes over, everything downstream starts to bend. Pricing stops looking like a simple retail decision and starts looking like a funnel strategy. Those heavy discounts on Black Friday, the buy one, get one half off ancestry sales, the referral bonuses that let you spit for almost free if you convinced enough friends and family to join. As a normal consumer product, the margins look terrible. As a data acquisition engine, they made perfect sense. Every cheap kit was a subsidized entry ticket into the database. Every holiday sale was a quiet land grab. The company could lose money on the box in your hand and still feel victorious, because the real asset was the sequence in the server and the survey you filled out on a lazy Sunday afternoon. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it's an example of what happens when a product is designed to feel intimate while the business is designed to be distant. That created a moral tension the branding never quite admitted. Can a company honestly sell itself as a tool of consumer empowerment, privacy, and self-knowledge when its long-term survival depends on selling aggregated insights about those same consumers to third parties who will never have to look them in the eye? The marketing spoke the language of personal discovery. The contract spoke the language of drug pipelines, exclusive rights, and multi-year data deals. And eventually, that quiet contradiction stopped being theoretical. It stepped into the spotlight the moment 23andMe signed a massive, headline-grabbing partnership with one of the biggest drug companies on Earth. A deal that would finally reveal who the DNA was really working for. There was a time when 23andMe was just the company that mailed you a tube and an identity crisis. In 2018, it suddenly became something much bigger, a $300 million bet for one of the oldest drug empires on Earth. That summer, GlaxoSmithKline announced it would invest $300 million into 23andMe and in return receive exclusive access to its genetic database for drug target discovery. Not a casual collaboration, a 4-year, first dibs, hands off our DNA kind of deal. Overnight, the spit kits that had looked like a quirky consumer gadget were reclassified in the language that really mattered on Wall Street, a proprietary, locked-up asset feeding a single pharmaceutical giant's pipeline. Let me take you back to what GSK actually wanted. Glaxo wasn't paying for ancestry charts or, you might like cilantro reports. It wanted the ability to scan millions of genomes, link them to self-reported health records, and statistically hunt for genetic variants tied to disease. If a rare mutation showed people with a certain gene stayed thin, had lower cholesterol, or didn't get a particular cancer, that mutation could point to a new drug target. The theory was simple and ruthless. Instead of guessing in the dark, use human genetics as a map and then design medicines that hit those targets with higher odds of success. For 23andMe, this was the moment the pivot stopped being a quiet strategy slide and became public theater. The company framed the announcement as a breakthrough for humanity. Press releases talked about accelerating the development of cures, making research more efficient, and turning every customer sample into a meaningful contribution to science. The message to the audience at home was flattering. Your 90 impulse buy was now part of a global quest to end disease. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it sounded like the noble side of Big Pharma, finally. But buried beneath the hopeful language was the fine print. GSK secured exclusivity on using 23andMe's data for certain drug discovery work, meaning other pharma companies would have to wait or negotiate around that wall. Revenue sharing structures promised 23andMe a cut of future drug profits, tying the company's financial fate to GSK's success in turning gene signals into blockbuster pills. It wasn't just a partnership, it was a partial handover of the crown jewel. The most valuable asset in 23andMe's young life, that enormous genetic database, was now effectively welded to a single corporate partner for the prime years of its commercial potential. On paper, it looked like a brilliant platform play, turning raw data into long-term upside. Yet the timing raised a quieter question. If the consumer business was as strong as the marketing suggested, why did the company need a $300 million lifeline from a drug giant, backed by exclusivity just to keep going? Because once a health data company leans on one patron to survive, the real story becomes harder to ignore. Who is the product and who is the customer? And 23andMe was about to test that line in the harshest way possible. Once that line was tested, the romance of spit for science gave way to something colder. The empire they were really building wasn't a fun ancestry playground. It was a living, breathing drug discovery machine fed by millions of kitchen table samples and a river of survey answers. There was a time when the company's science team would open the database and pull out, say, everyone who reported having type 2 diabetes, tens of thousands of people, same disease, different lives, same little plastic tube. Then they would scan their genomes, looking for variants that showed up more often in that diabetic group than in everyone else. A tiny signal here, a repeated blip there, and suddenly a pattern emerged, pointing to a biological pathway the textbooks had barely mentioned. Let me take you back to that moment in the lab. A cluster of variants near one gene lights up. People with the variant are, for example, 20% more likely to report diabetes on those surveys. That's not just trivia. That suggests this gene is doing something important in blood sugar regulation. Now imagine a chemist designing a molecule to nudge that pathway, a biologist testing it in cells, a clinical team planning trials around people who carry that exact variant. What began as a casual mail-in kit is now a map for where to aim the next drug. To make that map, they needed more than DNA. so the survey system went to work. Regular prompts pinged users. Any new diagnoses, new medications, changes in weight, sleep, smoking, pregnancies, family history of cancer. A few clicks during lunch, a bored response on the couch, and quietly, a longitudinal health record appeared. Millions of unpaid research participants, refreshing the dataset every time they checked a box. Because of how the economics of medicine work, one successful drug built on those insights could be worth billions over its life. Not millions, billions. A single blockbuster therapy can throw off more money than years of selling consumer kits at $99 a pop, with discounts in every holiday sale. The consumer side felt like a quirky health gadget. The pharma side looked like a lottery ticket with real odds. His story is one of ruthless efficiency and control. This story is one of ruthless optimization of consent. The company did not have to steal anything. Opt-in research checkboxes, dense privacy policies, and carefully worded emails meant that, technically, customers agreed. Legally clean. Ethically hazier. Most people were thinking about family origins, not oncology pipelines. They were picturing wealth in the form of fund discoveries, not shareholder value from licensing deals. And here comes the pattern interrupt. Picture a young parent at a kitchen table, late at night, spitting into a tube and sealing a box, curious about some lost branch of the family tree. Now picture, in another building entirely, a pharma R&D team huddled around a screen, using that same data to design a drug that parent might one day beg an insurance company to cover at thousands of dollars a month. It's an example of what happens when the product and the customer quietly trade places. That was the dream. A parent mailing in a 99 kit, a pharma giant paying hundreds of millions, and 23andMe sitting in the middle, quietly turning spit into money. But when the accountants finally ran the numbers, the empire on paper looked a lot less impressive in real life. Each kit carried its own gravity, lab processing, sample routing, barcoding, cold storage, logistics in both directions, customer support, answering anxious emails about ancestry and health, and above all, marketing. There was a time when customer acquisition meant Super Bowl ads, holiday discounts, and endless online promotions. By the time all of that was paid for, those 99 nines or $109 price tags left margins that were thin, sometimes negative, unless prices stayed high. And prices almost never stayed high. The problem went deeper than just margin. Software companies live on subscriptions, on payments that arrive every month whether the customer thinks about them or not. 23andMe lived on a one-time decision to spit in a tube. Most people bought one kit, maybe a second for a partner or a curious relative, and then they were done. No refill, no annual renewal, no upgrade to the 2025 version of your genome. To keep growing, the company had to keep finding new families, new holidays, new reasons to convince someone who had never tested before to finally try it. So attention turned to the pharma pipeline, where the money looked bigger, cleaner, more like the wealth investors expected. Deals like the $300 million partnership with GlaxoSmithKline promised a future where 23andMe would not just read DNA, it would help design drugs. But those contracts were lumpy, negotiated over months, sometimes years, and heavily dependent on a small circle of giant partners. Drug discovery itself moves even slower. A promising target today might not become an approved therapy for a decade, if it ever does. Revenue that looked huge on a press release could feel very small when spread across time, risk, and an entire public company's burn rate. Meanwhile, outside the boardroom, public sentiment was shifting. Let me take you back to the late 2000s, when handing over DNA felt like a fun science experiment. By the late 2010s, after endless headlines about data leaks and surveillance, the mood had changed. People started asking who would own their genetic life, who might use it against them, who might quietly sell it. Every skeptical article, every privacy scandal anywhere in tech made it harder to refill the database that powered those pharma deals. His story is one of relentless growth promises. Theirs was one of relentless user acquisition projections, both at times inspiring and at times chilling. So what happens when a company built on endless expansion, high costs, one-off customers, and slow, fragile pharma money finally hits a wall, and the public markets are still demanding more? So when that wall appeared, 23andMe didn't quietly slow down. It grabbed a financial battering ram. There was a time when the most fashionable way to go public wasn't a traditional IPO at all, but a financial shortcut with a dramatic name, the SPAC. A SPAC, our Special Purpose Acquisition Company, is a blank check shell. No product, no customers, just money and a stock ticker. It raises cash from investors first, then goes hunting for a private company to merge with. That merger is the backdoor IPO. Because the SPAC is already public, the target can list faster, with looser rules around talking about the future. Traditional IPOs are chained to historical numbers. SPACs were sold on what might happen someday. Let me take you back to 2021, peak SPAC fever. Interest rates were near zero, money was desperate for story, and anything that sounded like the future of healthcare could command a fortune. Into that frenzy walked 23andMe, announcing a deal with a SPAC backed by billionaire Richard Branson. The implied valuation? Around $3.5 billion. Not bad for a company still selling discounted spit kits by email promo code. The pitch deck read like a manifesto. Personalized medicine at scale. A drug discovery engine powered by one of the largest genetic databases on Earth. A consumer brand that would guide people through life, from ancestry curiosities to preventive care to targeted therapies. Slides showed huge total addressable markets, ambitious revenue forecasts, and a vision of an empire of genetics, data, and pharma royalties. At times inspiring and at times chilling, it promised that your DNA could be the bridge between your family history and your future prescriptions. But beneath the soaring charts, the numbers on the ground told a colder story. Revenue was limited, losses were ongoing, and the business still leaned heavily on one-off kit sales and a handful of pharma partnerships like the GlaxoSmithKline deal. The glamorous narrative of a data-driven drug powerhouse was resting on a consumer retail operation that looked more like a seasonal gadget business than a stable healthcare giant. Because of that fragile mix, every slowdown in new customers hit not just today's money, but tomorrow's scientific pipeline. Yet during the SPAC boom, that disconnect was easy to ignore. Cheap money made risk feel painless. Investors were hungry for growth, for disruption, for anything that sounded like Google for your genome. Projections that would have looked aggressive in a sober IPO roadshow suddenly felt normal. It's an example of what happens when story outruns reality, when PowerPoint curves go exponential, while the actual business still struggles to escape its own costs. For 23andMe, the merger finally delivered what years of private funding had chased: public market wealth, a big headline valuation, and fresh cash to keep the dream alive. But markets have a way of sobering up. Once the SPAC bubble burst and investors stopped paying for promises, the share price would begin to trace a brutally honest line through that dream, revealing just how strong or how fragile the business model underneath really was. So when 23andMe finally hit the NASDAQ, the story was still glowing. A consumer brand with millions of customers, a pharma pipeline, a genomic empire in the making. For a brief moment, the ticker symbol ME looked like destiny, not irony. The SPAC deal priced it near a multi-billion-dollar valuation. The first days brought a pop, and there was a time when the chart looked exactly like the pitch deck, up and to the right. Then the quarters started to roll in. Kit sales that had once exploded every holiday season began to flatten, then slip. Customer acquisition costs crept higher. Losses stayed stubborn. Each earnings call added another small crack, another guidance cut, another reminder that printing spit kits was not the same as printing money. The stock traced a slow, grinding descent, shedding half its value, then more, until that early euphoria looked less like a launch and more like a head fake. Public markets are ruthless in a way venture boards rarely are. Analysts wanted line items, not dreams. They pressed on margins for the consumer business, on churn, on how many people actually opted in to share their data. They wanted predictable revenue, not one-off holiday spikes. And above all, they demanded proof that the pharma side would scale beyond a few headline partnerships, that the GlaxoSmithKline deal was the beginning of a machine, not the high point of a story. Here the timelines collided. Drug discovery lives on a decade clock. Screen targets, run preclinical work, enter trials, navigate failure after failure, and maybe years later, one compound reaches patients. Wall Street lives on a 90-day clock. Miss 1 quarter and you get a warning. Miss 3 and you get a narrative. Slowing growth, limited visibility, unclear path to profitability. It's an example of what happens when a long, uncertain scientific journey is forced into the shape of a consumer tech company. Inside, that pressure translated into strain. The company had to keep funding research, maintaining biobanks, paying scientists, while also trimming marketing, renegotiating leases, freezing hiring. Layoffs arrived in waves. Teams that once talked about revolutionizing healthcare now argued over headcount, unit economics, and whether another discount on ancestry kits would hit the growth targets. The life of the lab was suddenly chained to the life of the quarterly report. On stage, though, the story stayed glossy. Investor days still opened with sweeping claims about democratizing genetics, with animations of DNA spirals and promises to transform how every family experiences healthcare. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the language leaned toward destiny, not difficulty. Pattern interrupt. Offstage, HR was scheduling exit interviews. Finance was cutting travel budgets, and the same slides about future drug royalties reappeared, even as projections slipped further into the 2030s. The empire in the slides was clean and inevitable. The reality was missed forecasts, down-round sentiment, and a market slowly losing patience with a company that had the world's DNA in its freezers, but no clear way to turn it into cash fast enough. Behind those slipping projections came the moment every high-growth company dreads, the email with the subject line about strategic realignment. There was a time when 23andMe's all-hands meetings were about moonshot drugs and changing the future of medicine. Now the calendar invites were about organizational focus and operational efficiency. In tech jargon, that translation is simple. Growth mode was over. Survival mode was back. The first major layoff announcement landed in early 2020, then again after the SPAC glow faded. Management framed it as a disciplined pivot, a way to concentrate on the most promising parts of the empire, to stop chasing every shiny partnership and double down on drug discovery and the core subscription product. On paper, it sounded almost noble, at times inspiring and at times chilling, as if cutting hundreds of jobs was a courageous act of stewardship, rather than a confession that the story was no longer matching the slide deck. Look closely at who left. Marketing teams that once dreamed up cheerful holiday spit kit campaigns were quietly reduced. Operations staff who kept the lab pipelines humming, customer support agents who handled anxious emails about health reports, even some of the R&D ranks that had been sold as the future of the company's wealth and power. When a mission-driven biotech starts trimming scientists, the message is clear. This is no longer an empire in conquest. This is a fortress under siege, counting every dollar of runway. It was not happening in a vacuum. As the broader biotech bubble deflated and the SPAC frenzy reversed, money dried up for companies that didn't have strong, steady cash flows. Interest rates rose, investors stopped paying for dreams, and the market suddenly remembered that Google for your genome still had to pay lab bills. It's an example of what happens when years of cheap money hide a fragile business model. The second the tide goes out, the firms that lived on hope and headlines have to shrink fast or disappear. Inside the building, the human cost was harder to spin. Let me take you back to those internal town halls. Founders talking about right sizing, slides about sharpened focus, and in the front rows, empty chairs where colleagues used to sit. People who had joined to democratize genetics now watch friends pack their desks into cardboard boxes. The life of the company shifted almost overnight from changing the world to extending the runway. Conversations that used to be about new features and bold studies turned into quiet questions about severance, vesting schedules, and who might be next. Because of those cuts, the payroll shrank, the burn rate fell, and the company finally bought itself a little time. But there was one thing it could not trim, one asset that only grew heavier as the layoffs mounted: the massive, intimate genetic database of millions of customers. Headcount could be reduced with a press release. The responsibility for that DNA could not. And as 23andMe got smaller and more desperate, the question hanging over the whole story was simple and unsettling. What would happen when money ran low, but the data mountain remained? There was a time when the most dangerous thing a company could hold about you was your social security number or your credit card. That era ended the moment millions of people mailed their saliva to 23andMe. A stolen card can be canceled, a breached password can be changed. DNA is forever. Genetic data is not just another line in a spreadsheet. It is a blueprint, a family tree, and a medical file woven into one code that never expires. It reveals who someone is related to, who they might secretly be related to, and which diseases might stalk their life decades from now. Even if a person never spits in a tube, a sibling or cousin who does can expose parts of that shared genetic story. One person's curiosity can map an entire family. Inside 23andMe, this didn't exist as a single neat profile. It was layers on layers. First, the raw genetic sequences, hundreds of thousands of markers across the genome, a dense, machine-readable script of human biology. On top of that, ancestry inferences, continental breakdowns, migration paths, the quiet unearthing of unknown parents and hidden half-siblings, then health risk assessments, elevated odds of Parkinson's, BRCA cancer variants, cholesterol problems, all translated into consumer-friendly dashboards that still hinted at life or death stakes. And that was only the beginning. Over years, customers answered survey after survey. Medical history, prescriptions, smoking, drinking, exercise, pregnancies, mental health, income, education, even tiny habits and fears. Because of this relentless data collection, 23andMe didn't just hold genomes, it held biographies, behaviors, and beliefs, all tethered to the most permanent ID a person has. It was an empire of intimate information, built quietly, one discount spit kit at a time. Regulators and bioethicists saw the danger. Even when laws like HIPAA didn't technically apply, the expectation was clear. Treat this as if it were the most sensitive medical record imaginable. There were debates about genetic discrimination, about insurers or employers quietly using risk markers, about whether a bad decision today could echo through a customer's children and grandchildren. Mishandling a password harms one person. Mishandling a genome can redraw an entire family's future. That is why the unspoken contract mattered so much. When someone sends a company their DNA, they are not just buying a fun ancestry map. They are trusting that the people on the other side will treat that sample with near sacred care, not as just another data set to be monetized, optimized, and defended with whatever budget is left after marketing. The story of 23andMe is one of people who believe that promise, who believe that a company backed by Silicon Valley wealth and scientific prestige would be too serious, too cautious, too proud to let anything happen. Let me take you back to what happened when that belief met reality, when the world's most sensitive database collided with layoffs, shrinking revenue, and a series of breaches that many customers would finally see as a simple verdict. The trust had been broken. When the breach headlines hit in late 2023, they didn't read like a routine cyber incident. They sounded like a plot twist. Hackers claimed they had scraped data from millions of 23andMe users, not just emails and names, but ancestry breakdowns, ethnic labels, and in some cases hints of genetic traits and long-mapped family connections. The most intimate parts of a person's biological story were suddenly being advertised on dark web forums like a clearance sale. There was a time when a leaked password meant a stolen Netflix account. Here, reused passwords meant something else entirely. According to 23andMe, the primary attack vector was credential stuffing. Attackers took old username-password combos from unrelated breaches, tried them en masse, and walked straight into accounts where people had reused logins. No need for elite zero-day exploits, just human laziness meeting a database that was never meant to be forgiving. But once inside, the real problem appeared. Because 23andMe wasn't just a vault of individual profiles, it was a network. Features like DNA relatives and family tree, designed to help customers find cousins, half-siblings, even surprise parents, turned each compromised account into a viewing window on many others. One person's weak password could expose the shared segments, surnames, and ancestral origins of dozens, sometimes hundreds, who had never spoken to that attacker and never given consent to be logged in at all. The attackers understood the value. They reportedly carved out sets of data marketed as Ashkenazi, Chinese, wealthy, even royal family adjacent, then sold or traded them. Because of that ruthless sorting and labeling, the breach wasn't just about privacy. It carried the ugly echo of older eras when ancestry and bloodlines were cataloged for far darker purposes. It's an example of what happens when a platform turns human life into tidy categories, then loses control of the categories. Public reaction was swift and angry. Headlines screamed about DNA data leaks. Customers who had mailed in a tube years earlier woke up to the idea that their genetic breadcrumbs, their family histories, might now be circulating in hacker chats. Many had shrugged at targeted ads or pharma partnerships. This felt different. This felt like the moment the empire's walls were visibly cracked. 23andMe responded with statements about security, rate limiting, and monitoring. The company emphasized that its core systems hadn't been directly breached, that the attackers relied on weak, reused passwords, technically accurate, emotionally useless. Because the uncomfortable question remained, if the design of the platform allows one compromised account to reveal a web of relatives, how much power does any individual really have to protect their data? Let me take you back to those warm commercials, smiling families, reunion hugs, the promise to find your relatives and see your connections. Now invert the camera. Imagine that same glowing network graph, not on a marketing slide, but on an attacker's laptop, being scraped, sorted, priced, and quietly sold. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the family tree had finally become an attack surface. That was the part 23andMe wanted to keep in the background, the moment when a family tree turns into an attack map. When the breach went public, the official story tried to push the camera back onto the users themselves. The company's first messaging was calm, precise, and strangely bloodless. No, their internal systems had not been hacked. No, the attackers had not broken the encryption on the genetic files. Instead, they said this was credential stuffing. Criminals took usernames and passwords leaked from other sites, tried them on 23andMe, and got lucky when people reused logins. Technically, that explanation was accurate. Morally, to many observers, it felt incomplete, because there was a time when you reused your password sounded like a personal failing. In 2023, it sounded more like blaming passengers for not wearing helmets on a commercial flight. Yes, individuals have a duty to protect themselves. But when a platform invites millions to hand over DNA, family histories, and health flags, the bar for "we did our part" sits higher than a boilerplate press release and a quiet FAQ update. Let me take you back to those delightful features that made the service viral in the first place. Relative matching, shared DNA segments, opt-in tools to compare ancestry and traits with strangers who happen to share great-grandparents. On a normal day, those design choices felt charming, even at times inspiring and at times chilling, as people reunited with a lost siblings or discovered hidden branches of their family. On a breach day, the same features acted like a force multiplier. Compromise one account, and the attacker does not just see one person. They see hundreds of relatives, their relationships, their ethnic breakdowns, hints of disease risk, sometimes even full names. Because of those choices, the asymmetry of risk became brutal. For the company, the downside was measurable: a PR crisis, regulatory questions, maybe lawsuits, maybe a temporary dip in valuation. Embarrassing, expensive, but survivable. For users, the downside was permanent: genetic data that cannot be changed, family connections that cannot be unwoven, intimate details that can be copied infinitely and never fully pulled back from the open market. It is an example of what happens when information about life itself is treated like any other user profile. So the deeper question emerged: if an empire is built on amassing one of the world's largest collections of human DNA, is industry standard security ever enough? Or should the default expectation be something closer to banking plus witness protection, layered with design choices that assume breach, not just hope against it? And here is the twist. Long before credential stuffing headlines, privacy advocates had been warning that the real danger was not only external hackers, it was the internal gravity of the business model itself, quietly pulling genetic data toward partners, products, and profit. The breach was a shock. The incentives behind it were older. In the next part, that quiet, relentless pull finally steps into the spotlight. That quiet pull had been visible for years, if anyone wanted to see it. There was a time when every privacy advocate on the planet was waving a giant red flag, while the rest of the world was mailing in saliva and comparing pie charts of their Viking heritage. Let me take you back to those early warnings. Lawyers, bioethicists, and civil liberties groups kept repeating the same 3 alarms. Once a genome is in a database, it is almost impossible to anonymize. Law enforcement will eventually come knocking, and insurers will be very interested in any hint of future disease. This wasn't sci-fi paranoia. The entire life of a person is encoded in that sequence. It says something about their parents, their children, their whole family tree. Delete a name, keep the genome, and the identity is still hiding in plain sight. 23andMe's public story tried to calm that fear. The company promised consent forms, opt-ins, and de-identified data. Executives talked about empowering customers, democratizing genetics, and keeping control in the hands of users. On the website, the language was soothing. In the terms of service, it was ruthless. Pages of dense legal text quietly granted broad rights to use, analyze, and share data with research partners, while most people clicked agree faster than they could say BRCA mutation. It's an example of what happens when marketing speaks in plain English and the real power is hidden in legalese. Meanwhile, outside 23andMe's walls, the most dramatic privacy warning didn't begin with a health report. It began with a murder investigation. Detectives used an open genealogy site to track down the Golden State Killer, not by his own DNA, but through distant relatives who had uploaded theirs. The message was brutal and simple. One curious cousin can volunteer an entire family into genetic surveillance. No one at the Thanksgiving table signed that consent form. That case was a pattern interrupt for the whole industry. If police could triangulate a serial killer from recreational ancestry uploads, what could they do? With a database of more than 12 million 23andMe customers? The company insisted it would resist broad fishing expeditions, require court orders, and publish transparency reports. Yet the core dilemma remained. When the state shows up with a subpoena and a public safety narrative, how strong is a private company's spine, especially one that needs friendly regulators to survive? Underneath all this sat a deeper tension. The more valuable the data became for science, the more dangerous it became for privacy. To discover drug targets, to predict disease, to build an empire of genetic insights that might finally justify the money investors poured in, the company had to link DNA to age, sex, ancestry, health records, even location. Strip away too many identifiers and the research collapses. Keep them in, and re-identification is only a clever grad student away. At times inspiring and at times chilling, this was the trade. Progress in exchange for permanent traceability. So the question hanging over 23andMe was simple and unforgiving. Can a business under relentless pressure to grow, to find revenue, to satisfy Wall Street, ever be the true guardian of something as intimate as your genome? Or was the breach just the moment when its real loyalties finally became impossible to ignore? There was a time when mailing your spit to a lab felt less like a transaction and more like a pilgrimage. For $99 and a few weeks of waiting, you weren't just buying a report, you were buying a story, hidden heritage, lost relatives, an origin myth that could finally make sense of why you felt different at Thanksgiving. The pitch was seductive. Not only would a tiny tube tell you you're 12% Scandinavian, it might whisper that your ancestors survived plagues, crossed oceans, escaped poverty, and somehow delivered you to this moment. In a secular age, ancestry turned into a quiet, genetic religion. The double helix became a family Bible you could print as a PDF. 23andMe and its rivals understood this perfectly. Their ads didn't talk about sequencing machines or data pipelines. They talked about life, about belonging, about the power of finding your people. Commercials showed grandparents crying on doorsteps, cousins hugging in airports, a man trading in his lederhosen for a kilt after learning he was more Scottish than German. The act of spitting in a tube was framed as intimate, almost sacred, like sending a letter to your past self. Because of that framing, millions lined up. The same tools that made it feel magical, relative matching, family networks, sharing buttons, also turned the platform into a social engine. You could message a second cousin in another country, build an online tree, compare traits with strangers who shared your DNA. Viral growth, free marketing, exponential network effects. It looked for a while, at times inspiring and at times chilling, like an empire of kinship. Then the other shoe dropped. The moment those relative matching features scaled, they stopped being harmless curiosities and started acting like forensic tools. Surprise paternity revelations, children discovering the man who raised them was not their biological father, adults suddenly meeting half-siblings conceived with the same sperm donor who had never told anyone. Because of one discounted holiday kit, decades of carefully managed family secrets detonated at Christmas. It's an example of what happens when a product built on curiosity collides with realities people never consented to face. The same network that reunited adoptees with birth parents also exposed affairs from the 1970s, revealed fertility clinic fraud, and dragged long-buried decisions into the harsh light of a web dashboard. There was no, "Are you sure you want to know if your entire identity is about to change" button. And remember, this emotional chaos wasn't a side effect. It was the growth engine. The more shocking the discoveries, the more people talked, the more kits sold, the more data flowed into a company still searching for a sustainable way to turn spit into money. So picture two scenes running in parallel. On one side, a crowded living room, a camera rolling, a woman opening her results and screaming with joy as she finds a long-lost cousin, and the whole family erupts. On the other, a single person at a laptop late at night, staring at a quiet notification. You have one close family match. Same feature, same platform. Two lives suddenly pulled in opposite directions. Those emotional ancestry reveals were the front of the stage. The real ambition, the thing that made investors lean forward, was behind the curtain. Health. Not just who your family was, but what might be lurking in your blood. There was a time when 23andMe promised to be a kind of over-the-counter crystal ball. Before the FDA crackdown, the company hinted that one saliva tube could forecast your future diseases, your drug reactions, even your lifespan. After the warning letter and years of negotiation, that vision came back in a narrower, more sanitized form. Carrier status reports for conditions like cystic fibrosis, selected disease risk reports for things like late onset Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, limited pharmacogenomic insights about how the body might process certain drugs, and a grab bag of wellness traits about sleep, weight, and caffeine. On paper, it sounded like power. In practice, it was probability. The reports were built on partial coverage of the genome, focused on a small set of known variants. A Parkinson's report might look at a handful of mutations and say the risk was increased or decreased, while leaving thousands of other relevant sites untouched. A BRCA carrier report could flag certain high-impact breast cancer mutations, but only the ones the chip actually tested. Everything else, invisible. Because the science was probabilistic and incomplete, the emotional reactions could swing wildly. Some customers saw no variant detected and walked away with a dangerous sense of invincibility, skipping screenings or ignoring family history. Others saw a modestly elevated risk and spiraled into late-night panic, Googling survival rates for diseases they might never develop. The fine print said these were not diagnoses, that medical decisions should go through a doctor, that this was only one piece of the story. But when a brightly colored dashboard tells someone their Alzheimer's risk is high, the disclaimer at the bottom is not what the brain remembers. From a business perspective, though, this was gold. Health reports justified a higher price than pure ancestry kits, created a reason to upgrade, and helped 23andMe claim a unique position in a crowded market of spit tubes and family trees. Ancestry competitors could tell you where your great-grandparents came from. 23andMe could suggest how your body might respond to statins. Same lab, same chip, same data engine, but now wrapped in the language of medical insight rather than genealogy. It's an example of what happens when complex science is packaged as a consumer product. The underlying genetics remained constrained, the regulatory leash stayed tight, and yet the marketing story grew larger than the actual medical value. Was this health empire ever strong enough to stand on its own, or was it always just a glossy layer on top of something else 23andMe really wanted from your DNA? So while 23andMe was polishing this health empire, outside the lab a different kind of battle was raging. There was a time when the loudest names in consumer DNA weren't talking about cancer risk or drug response at all. They were talking about your great-grandfather, your lost cousin, and whether you were 12% Viking. Let me take you back to the rise of Ancestry DNA and MyHeritage. These were not biotech visionaries promising to reinvent medicine. They were genealogy businesses with a simple, emotionally loaded story. Trace your family, find your people, fill in the branches on the tree. Ancestry had already spent years selling subscriptions to digitize records and family trees. When it added spit tubes on top of that, the product snapped neatly into place. MyHeritage followed a similar path, layering DNA on an existing genealogy platform and chasing global reach with relentless online ads. The contrast with 23andMe was sharp. Ancestry and MyHeritage led with Ancestry only, or at least Ancestry first, kits. Clean pitch, low risk, easy holiday gift. 23andMe tried to sell a mixed health and ancestry story that lived in a regulatory gray zone and a psychological one. Some people wanted to know if they were Irish. Fewer wanted a Saturday morning email about elevated disease risk. And while 23andMe wrestled with the FDA, its rivals were running Super Bowl-style marketing blitzes, flooding TV and social media with tearful reunions and surprise heritage reveals. Because of that focus, the network effects in the ancestry game started to bend the market. The value of relative matching explodes as the database grows. Each new person doesn't just add their own DNA, they become a bridge between other people, lighting up second cousins, third cousins, entire branches of a family that suddenly connect. Ancestry and MyHeritage leaned into this, turning their growing databases into a self-reinforcing magnet. The bigger they got, the better the matches, the more compelling the story, the more customers they pulled in. 23andMe had a large database too, but its attention was split. Health reports, ancestry breakdowns, trait curiosities, all bundled together. Meanwhile, Ancestry and MyHeritage were quietly building an empire of family graphs and record archives, and they were doing it with a product that didn't scare regulators or grandparents. Then came the price wars. Holiday discounts turned into an annual ritual. Black Friday, Prime Day, Mother's Day. Kits that once cost $109 dropped to $99.99, then $79, then $59, sometimes even lower. Consumers learned to wait for sales. DNA became another retail promotion, stacked next to air fryers and phone chargers. It's an example of what happens when a high-tech novelty turns into a commodity on the shelf. Because of this race to the bottom, the core product, selling spit kits, stopped looking like a path to real wealth and started looking like a marketing expense. everyone was burning money on ads, slashing prices, and training customers to expect more for less. The business of DNA tests alone was shrinking even as databases grew. So in a world where every competitor was fighting over who could sell the cheapest tube, the only real power would belong to whoever controlled what lived behind those tubes, the data. And that is where 23andMe's story, at times inspiring and at times chilling, finally reveals what game it was really playing. Once the race to the bottom on kit prices began, the real game moved somewhere else. The plastic tube, the little cardboard box, the holiday discount codes that made these tests feel like party favors, that was just the bait. The prize, the thing every serious player quietly worshipped, was the growing mountain of human genomes sitting on their servers. There was a time when the money was in the box itself. Early adopters paid hundreds of dollars per test. Margins were healthy, and investors could pretend this was a premium gadget business with a bit of science sprinkled on top. But as competition flooded in and costs plunged, the economic center of gravity shifted. The short-term sale became a rounding error next to the long-term value of what that sale unlocked. A DNA sample, a consent checkbox, a lifetime of health surveys, and the right to mine all of it again and again. So 23andMe was not alone. Rival companies watched the FDA crush health reports, watched prices fall, and drew the same conclusion. If the front-end product was getting commoditized, the back-end had to become the empire. They chased research collaborations with universities, sold de-identified datasets to drug companies, and, like 23andMe, launched internal drug discovery programs, hoping that somewhere in those millions of genomes sat the next billion-dollar therapy. Not only did 23andMe sign a $300 million partnership with GlaxoSmithKline, other firms also pitched themselves as essential pipelines for pharma, promising faster trials, better targets, and cheaper failures. Because everyone was chasing the same prize, the industry tilted toward a winner-take-most dynamic. The largest, most diverse data set would attract the biggest checks, the best partners, the most leverage. That meant one thing: growth at any cost. Companies slashed kit prices, ran relentless holiday sales, paid influencers, paid affiliates, paid for ads that made it feel like buying a personality quiz. Losing money on each kit was acceptable, even rational, if it meant locking another genome into the vault. Every new customer was no longer just revenue, it was an appreciating asset. But when every major player is, in practice, a data broker, what does choice even mean? A privacy-first DNA company sounds reassuring until the business reality sets in. Sequencing is expensive, lab work is not magic, and investors expect returns. If the only sustainable way to survive is to monetize data, then the entire category is structurally misaligned with user interests, no matter how friendly the app looks. It is an example of what happens when the product and the true customer are not the same person. And here the language splits. Publicly, the mission was to democratize genetics, to empower families, to unlock personal health insights for everyone. Internally, slide decks fixated on lifetime value, churn, consent rates, and data monetization funnels. The story on the website was about curiosity and connection. The story in the boardroom was about extraction and control. Let me take you back to how that gap, at times inspiring and at times chilling, would only grow wider as 23andMe's problems escalated. Inside the company, that gap turned into a plan that sounded less like a consumer app and more like a biotech empire in the making. If 23andMe was sitting on one of the largest genetic databases on Earth, why stop at selling access to it? Why not turn raw DNA and survey answers into patented pills, into real money, into power that went far beyond spit kits? There was a time when the slides stopped talking about engagement funnels and started talking about therapeutic areas. The company hired veteran drug discovery scientists from Big Pharma, people who spoke in acronyms and pathways instead of NPS scores. Labs were built, benches stocked, robotic freezers humming with samples. Leadership began announcing internal pipelines, oncology programs here, immunology targets there, candidate molecules marching through preclinical models as if a consumer brand had woken up one morning and decided to become Genentech. The logic felt irresistible. Selling data to pharma for a few $100 million over many years was nice. Owning a successful drug could be worth tens of billions over its life. Move up the value chain, control the targets, develop proprietary drugs, and suddenly, the company wouldn't just rent out its database, it would own the downstream wealth it created. On paper, it was a clean story. From cheek swab to clinical trial, from living room curiosity to FDA-approved therapy. But drug development is not an app launch. It is a slow, brutal war of attrition. Most candidates fail. The ones that don't still devour years and oceans of capital. Because of that unforgiving math, timelines stretch a decade or more, while public markets demand progress every quarter. It's an example of what happens when Silicon Valley speed collides head-on with biotech reality. Promises can be made in months that science cannot keep for years. Investors, at first, were captivated. A vertically integrated genetics to drugs platform sounded like a fairy tale for anyone chasing the next great fortune. Not only would 23andMe own the relationship with millions of customers, it would also, in theory, own the medicines built from their DNA. The story was at times inspiring and at times chilling, a consumer brand quietly trying to become a pharmaceutical power without ever losing its friendly smile. Yet beneath the excitement sat a quiet skepticism. Could a company born selling ancestry reports really compete with entrenched pharma giants who had spent decades mastering clinical trials, regulation, and the ruthless politics of hospital formularies? Could survey data and self-reported traits really outgun traditional biology in the lab? As the science ramped up, burn rates climbed, the clock ticked, and the market's patience thinned. The empire they were trying to build needed time, their balance sheet did not. And soon, the question wouldn't be how many drugs 23andMe could discover, but whether it would survive long enough to see any of them reach a patient at all. There was a time when 23andMe's biggest problem was explaining what a spit kit even was. That was the cute phase. The next phase was less charming, learning the meaning of burn rate while the company was already a public, shrinking promise on the NASDAQ ticker. Burn rate, in this life, was not an abstract finance term. It was the speed at which 23andMe turned cash into lab salaries, cloud bills, marketing campaigns, and long-shot experiments, versus the money trickling back in from $99 ancestry kits and modest pharma milestones. Every quarter, the gap between what went out and what came in told a simple story. If nothing changed, here is the date the bank account hit zero. Let me take you back to the moment the company tried to escape that math through drug discovery. Drug discovery doesn't just increase burn, it detonates it. Suddenly, the line items are medicinal chemists from top pharma, biostatisticians, clinical operations teams, specialized sequencing platforms, animal studies, and then the real furnace. Human trials, each phase dragging on for years under regulatory scrutiny, before a single dollar of drug revenue appears. The dream was that a massive genetic database would make this faster and cheaper. The reality was that the meter still ran. Inside leadership meetings, the trade-offs became brutal. Cut R&D, slow the drug programs, and protect the remaining cash, or double down, keep hiring, and pray that a breakthrough arrived before the market closed its wallet. It's an example of what happens when a company tries to build an empire of future wealth on top of a present-day business that never really threw off serious money. The consumer side printed spit, not profits. As the stock slid far below its SPAC debut and quarterly losses stayed stubbornly high, investor fatigue set in. Early believers who once loved the Google for your genome story started counting years instead of slogans. How long since the big GlaxoSmithKline deal? How many pipeline updates without a pivotal trial? His story is one of patient capital. 23andMe's was at times inspiring and at times chilling because patience in public markets has a price. On earnings calls, the tone shifted from visionary to defensive. Guidance tightened, headcount shrank. The company talked more about runway than revolution. There was a time when every new trait report could be spun as another step toward a genomic future. Now, each new feature was weighed against how many extra months of cash it might cost. Then a pattern interrupted. In one building, a scientist stared at fresh data, a promising signal tying a genetic variant to a disease pathway, the kind of result careers are built on. In another, the CFO stared at a spreadsheet showing quarters of runway left, not years. One room celebrated a potential breakthrough. The other asked a colder question. Would there be enough money to ever turn it into a drug a patient could actually touch? In Silicon Valley, there was a time when that spreadsheet in the CFO's hands would not have scared anyone. Losses were a feature, not a bug. The legend said that if a company just kept collecting users, kept hoarding data, kept growing the graph, the money would finally show up. This myth built an empire. Facebook harvested clicks and friendships. Google indexed the entire public internet. And for a while it looked almost mystical. The more data they swallowed, the more the Yed machine printed wealth. Not only did they turn attention into money, they did it at global scale, with margins that made old industrial barons look quaint. So founders began repeating a quiet mantra to investors. Let us get the data first. The business model will come later. But biology is not a news feed. Genes are not search queries. Here, the feedback loop moves slowly, wrapped in regulation, ethics boards, and the blunt reality that human bodies do not update on the same quarterly cadence as an app. Every experiment can trigger an FDA review. Every insight can collide with privacy law. Every aggressive idea risks crossing a line that cannot be quietly rolled back with a patch. Let me take you back to the early 2010s, when 23andMe leaned hard into the myth of the infinite runway. Millions of people paid to spit in a tube, mailed it back, and unlocked ancestry charts and health hints. Behind those colorful reports sat one of the richest genetic datasets on Earth. The kind of asset that, in a pure tech story, should have guaranteed power and recurring revenue for decades. Except this time, the ad slot never appeared. 23andMe could not simply auction off likely to get diabetes next to a banner for running shoes. Regulatory constraints closed off the easiest money. Ethical concerns made the next tier of ideas radioactive. Not all data can be monetized safely, and not all patterns in DNA can be turned into a subscription. So the company pivoted upward into pharma. It signed headline deals like a $300 million partnership with GlaxoSmithKline, promising to turn correlations in its database into new drugs. On paper, it sounded ruthless and efficient. Skip years of blind trial and error. Jump straight to targets suggested by real human genomes. In practice, drug discovery still moved at the old biological pace, burning cash, lawyers, and patience. The opportunity cost was enormous. Years of runway, billions in market value, and a whole generation of talent were spent chasing a vision that treated healthcare like another consumer internet platform. It underestimated the friction of insurance, of doctors, of regulators, of families who were happy to trade memes online, but felt very differently about trading their medical life. It's an example of what happens when the tech playbook of move fast and break things slams into the one arena where breaking trust can poison an entire field. When the myth of the infinite runway meets the finite patience of patients, what exactly are founders willing to risk next? Regulators looked at that same runway and reached for the brakes. Medicine, unlike software, is built on a different commandment: first, do no harm, even if it means doing nothing for a very long time. There was a time when that slowness was a survival trait, forged in the memory of thalidomide babies, bad blood experiments, and miracle cures that turned out to be poison. Let me take you back to how this world is designed. Medical regulation is intentionally slow, conservative, and biased toward inaction. To approve a new drug or a new kind of test, agencies demand years of trials, mountains of data, and a level of statistical certainty that would make most startup dashboards blush. The system would rather delay a good innovation than accidentally unleash a bad one, because in this universe, a false positive is not a minor bug. It is a real person making a life decision on a lie. Around that regulatory core, an entire defensive perimeter grew. Bioethics committees decide what kinds of questions researchers are even allowed to ask. Institutional review boards, or IRBs, examine study protocols line by line, arguing over consent forms, data use, and whether a survey question might push a vulnerable patient too far. Medical societies publish guidelines on genetic testing, warning doctors when a test is experimental, when it is misleading, and when it should never be used to guide treatment. Their story is one of caution, of slowly earned trust that, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. Now place that culture next to the typical venture-backed startup. Rapid iteration, constant A/B testing on live users, pushing updates first and writing the apology blog post later. In that world, breaking things is a badge of honor, a sign that the company is moving fast enough to outpace rivals and finally grab wealth and power. But when the product is a report about cancer risk or Alzheimer's, breaking things means something else. It means a terrified customer misunderstanding a risk score, canceling a pregnancy, or skipping a real medical evaluation because a colorful dashboard said everything looked fine. 23andMe ended up standing right in the middle of this collision. To some, it was a democratizing force, tearing genetic information away from ivory tower labs and giving it directly to families for the price of a dinner out. To others, it looked ruthless and commercially motivated, a company selling life-altering health interpretations without the evidentiary backbone that traditional medicine demands. When the FDA stepped in and froze its health reports, that fight stopped being theoretical. Because of 23andMe, regulators, ethicists, and medical societies were forced to draw new lines in public. What counts as medical advice? When does a fun ancestry tool quietly become a diagnostic device? And if consumer genetics lives in this gray zone between entertainment and medicine, who exactly is allowed to profit from it next? And under whose rules? There was a time when DNA felt distant and abstract, locked away in textbooks in hospital labs. 23andMe dragged it into the living room, onto the kitchen table, into family group chats. Suddenly, the double helix wasn't a diagram. It was a holiday gift. Let me take you back to one of the stories that made the promise feel real. A young couple in their early 30s, both healthy, both with no obvious medical history, spit in the tubes because a friend said it was fun. the health report came back with a quiet red flag. One partner was a carrier for a severe recessive disease that can leave children unable to move or breathe. The other, also a carrier. That single line of text sent them to a genetic counselor, to an IVF clinic, to months of hard conversations. They delayed pregnancy, spent real money, and finally used embryo screening. Their child was born without the mutation. For them, 23andMe wasn't a toy. It rewired the entire timeline of their family. Another customer opened a report and found a high genetic risk score for a heart condition that had killed an uncle out of nowhere at 48. No symptoms yet, no warning from any doctor. He took the printout to a cardiologist, pushed for imaging, and caught an early problem: medications, diet changes, aggressive monitoring. 10 years later, he tells the story at dinner parties, at times inspiring and at times chilling, an unpaid evangelist for a 99 kit. But the same pipeline that produced quiet miracles also detonated living rooms. A middle-aged woman logged in to check ancestry for a school project with her kid and found a half-brother she'd never heard of. Her father had died years earlier, pillar of the community, church deacon, the man who taught her about honesty. The half-brother had his face. That discovery did not lead to a heartwarming reunion. It led to a screaming match with her mother, a shattered memory of her childhood, and 3 siblings who no longer spend holidays together. Others misread the numbers. A man saw elevated risk for Alzheimer's and assumed it was a sentence, spiraling into anxiety before any doctor ever saw the report. Another saw decreased risk for diabetes and treated it like a cheat code. Years later, his A1C said otherwise. It's an example of what happens when medical probabilities are dropped into everyday life without the guardrails of a clinic. Because of these stories, the brand split in two. On one side, people whose lives were nudged or even saved by an unexpected result. They told friends to test. They framed the printouts. On the other, people who watch families fracture over secret children, surprise paternity, and misunderstood charts. They warned loudly never to mail your DNA to a company. Every story became part of the social calculus. Before buying a kit, future customers weren't reading earnings reports. They were weighing dinner table legends of salvation against whispered tales of betrayal. Then, pattern interrupt. Pull back from the crying in kitchens and the late-night Google searches, and cut to a glass office building in Silicon Valley. Inside, 23andMe executives weren't trading family secrets. They were trading slide decks, debating churn, and hunting for a business model that could turn all of those very personal lives into a sustainable empire of data and profit. Behind that glass, the PowerPoint slides didn't talk about divorce or half-siblings. They talked about publications, drug targets, and something much grander, saving lives at scale. Because while 23andMe was fumbling for a business model, it was quietly building one of the most powerful research machines genetics had ever seen. Let me take you back to the moment that machine really came into focus. When the company passed 1 million genotyped customers, then 2 million, then 10, the game changed. Overnight, what academic labs struggled to do with 10,000 volunteers, 23andMe could do with a push notification and a weekend survey. Genome-wide association studies, or GWAS, suddenly went from hundreds of thousands of people to millions, turning faint statistical whispers into signals you could no longer ignore. There was a time when linking a single genetic variant to a common disease took years of grant writing and careful recruitment. 23andMe began cranking out papers that tied thousands of variants to everything from depression and migraine to hair color, sleep habits, and drug side effects. They ran massive studies on Parkinson's disease, discovering new regions of the genome that hinted at previously unknown biology. They mapped genetic influences on how people respond to certain medications, on whether they flush from alcohol, even on how likely they were to quit smoking. It wasn't subtle, it was a fire hose. Scale mattered. For complex traits like height, diabetes, or autoimmune disease, no single mutation tells the story. You need oceans of data to see the tiny nudges each variant contributes. Traditional cohorts of a few thousand volunteers were like peering through a keyhole. Millions of 23andMe customers created a panoramic window, letting researchers build polygenic scores, refine risk estimates, and test ideas about how genes and environment collide in everyday life. But that empire of data came with cracks. The majority of 23andMe's customers were of European ancestry, heavily skewed toward people with internet access, disposable money, and enough spare time to answer long questionnaires. Whole regions of the world, whole communities inside the same city, were barely represented. Because of that bias, some findings travel poorly outside the narrow slice of humanity that could afford to spit in a tube. Then there was the reliance on self-reported life details, diagnoses typed into a browser, not confirmed in a hospital chart. Heights and weights remembered, not measured. For traits like hair loss or motion sickness, that worked surprisingly well. For subtle mental health conditions or rare diseases, it meant noise, misclassification, and the constant risk of overinterpreting weak associations that looked exciting on a slide but flimsy in the real world. Yet, at times inspiring and at times chilling, the wins were real. 23andMe's data helped identify new genetic signals for Parkinson's that pointed drug hunters toward pathways involved in cellular cleanup. Its partnership with pharmaceutical giants fed anonymized variant lists into early-stage drug discovery, helping prioritize targets with human genetic backing, which tend to have higher success rates in the clinic. It's an example of what happens when a commercial product accidentally becomes a global research infrastructure: faster insights, more replication, and a shorter path between a hunch in a lab and a molecule in a trial. So yes, scientific progress happened. Papers were published, careers were built, and genuine understanding of human biology accelerated. But here is the uncomfortable question that hangs over all of it. Does that progress justify building a fragile, loss-making, privacy-risky business on top of consumers who never fully grasped that their family stories were being converted into a tradable research asset? That research asset had a price tag. The customers did too, because every 23andMe transaction was really two deals at once. Up front, 100 or 2 in cash for a plastic tube, ancestry charts, and health risk reports. Underneath, a quiet transfer of genetic blueprints that could help design drugs sold for thousands of dollars per patient per year. Let me take you back to that moment at the laptop. A user enters a credit card, pays for a kit, spits in a tube, and waits. A few weeks later, they get a notification, open the app, and see colorful graphs about Neanderthal ancestry, carrier status, maybe a warning about elevated risk for a disease. That's the visible story. Hidden in the background, their data is flowing into one of the largest human genomics databases on Earth, where it can be combined, sliced, modeled, and finally turned into intellectual property. There was a time when this was framed as a fair trade. You get insight, the company gets anonymized data, and humanity gets new medicines. But look at the money. A future drug that lowers heart disease risk might sell for $8,000 a year, protected by patents, marketed by a global sales force, and folded into a pharma empire of recurring revenue. The person whose rare genetic variant helped identify the target, they paid to enter the study. Then, years later, they may pay again at the pharmacy counter. Because there was no revenue sharing, no clause that said if your data helps discover a blockbuster therapy, a tiny royalty flows back to you or your family. No dashboard where you could see, in dollars, how much value your contribution had created. Users got entertainment, a few medically relevant alerts, and the warm glow of helping science, while investors and corporate partners got assets that could, in theory, throw off cash for decades. It's an example of what happens when ownership of data is defined by terms of service instead of moral intuition. Alternative models do exist in the background. Imagine a cooperative biobank where each participant owns a tokenized share of the dataset, licenses access to specific projects, and receives a cut of any commercial upside, or a marketplace where individuals lease their genomes to researchers for limited periods, with transparent pricing and revocable consent. At times inspiring and at times chilling, these visions turn personal biology into an income stream. But they haven't gone mainstream because they are slower, messier, harder to scale, and far less attractive to investors chasing clean, centralized control. So the narrative stayed narrow. Marketing spoke about empowerment, curiosity, connecting with long-lost relatives, contributing to cures. It rarely dwelled on the sheer financial leverage of combining millions of such contributions into a proprietary dataset that could anchor $300 million pharma deals and entire drug pipelines. Now picture the pattern from the other side of the counter. A line of patients at a Walgreens or CVS shuffling forward under fluorescent lights, credit cards in hand. One of them once mailed in a 23andMe kit, laughed about Neanderthal genes, clicked agree on a research consent form, and forgot. Years later, they're paying a hefty copay for a medication whose early signal came from people exactly like them, whose genomes were once boxed up, shipped off, and given away for free. That copay at Walgreens is the hangover. The party happened years earlier, when health tech promised to blow up the entire medical empire with apps, wearables, and a little spit in a tube. There was a time when every founder pitch sounded the same. Cheap tests, instant insights, AI doctors in your pocket. Theranos would replace the lab. Jawbone would own your wrist. Dozens of genomic startups would decode your life. Not only were they going to make medicine faster and cheaper, they were going to make it glamorous, subscription-based, and venture-backed. Then reality walked in. Because of ruthless timelines, shaky science, and the need to keep money flowing, the gap between promise and proof kept widening. Theranos lied outright and imploded. Others just quietly shrank, sold for scraps, or pivoted into corporate wellness. The pattern was the same: huge claims, glossy decks, very little that a hospital could actually bill Medicare for. Gartner has a name for this rhythm: the hype cycle. First comes the innovation trigger, a new technology that feels like magic. Then the peak of inflated expectations, when every slide shows exponential curves and trillion-dollar markets. After that, the trough of disillusionment, when pilots fail, regulators step in, and investors stop nodding along. Finally, for the survivors, there is a plateau of productivity, a quieter phase where the technology finds a smaller, more boring, more real role. Let me take you back to 23andMe's arc and lay it on that curve. The innovation trigger was simple and seductive. Mail order DNA. Pay once, learn your ancestry, your health risks, maybe your ideal diet, all from home. The peak came fast. Magazine covers, celebrity investors, Google's money, party photos with spit kits as party favors. It felt at times inspiring and at times chilling. a friendly consumer brand sitting on top of something as intimate as your genome. Then, in 2013, the trough. The FDA slammed on the brakes, ordering 23andMe to stop marketing health reports. Overnight, the core promise was gone. The company survived by reframing its life, not as a test seller, but as a data factory. Millions of kits, millions of consents, and, behind the scenes, multi-million-dollar deals with pharma giants like GlaxoSmithKline to hunt for drug targets. Going public via SPAC was supposed to signal the plateau of productivity, proof that the model worked. Instead, the market looked at slowing kit sales, heavy losses, privacy fears, data breaches, and marked the valuation down again and again. The dream of effortless consumer genomics wealth met the spreadsheet. Yet something always survives the wreckage. Biobanks do not vanish. Sequencing pipelines, cloud infrastructure, regulatory precedents, and a more sober understanding of what genetic data can and cannot do remain, waiting for the next generation of founders who watch this story unfold. The question now is brutal and simple. When the hype cycle finally finishes with 23andMe, will it be remembered as a cautionary tale, a necessary experiment, or the rough first draft of a far more disciplined genetic empire? And who exactly will own what's left of your DNA when that answer arrives? There was a time when mailing your DNA to a startup felt futuristic, harmless, even a little fun. You spat in a tube, unlocked a colorful dashboard, and somewhere in Silicon Valley, a pitch deck quietly claimed your genome would fund the next trillion-dollar empire. But the 23andMe era left scars. Its story is one of brilliant science wrapped around a hollow business, and that has hard lessons for every founder who thinks a one-time purchase can carry a lifetime of ambition. Spit kits brought in money once, then stopped. Regulators could freeze the core product overnight. And the whole plan depended on monetizing the most intimate data a person can share, as if ultra-sensitive DNA were just another ad tech dataset waiting to be squeezed. So the next wave of consumer biotech is already mutating. Instead of one-off kits, founders are chasing subscription health platforms, continuous blood testing, microbiome tracking, wearables tied into monthly coaching. Not just data, but a relationship. At-home diagnostics are creeping closer to the clinic, promising that a finger prick in the kitchen will talk directly to a physician, a pharmacist, an insurer. The dream is recurring revenue, tighter medical integration, and fewer late-night emails from the FDA. And then there is the privacy counter revolution. After watching 23andMe sell access to pharma and then suffer a headline-grabbing breach, new startups whisper a different story. Encrypted computation, data that never leaves your device, federated learning that lets algorithms train on your life without anyone seeing it. On paper, it sounds at times inspiring and at times chilling. A future where no one owns the raw genome, but everyone rents the insights. Investors, too, have been rewired. During the 23andMe boom, we'll figure out the model once we have the data could raise hundreds of millions. Now that line lands with a thud. Because of the ruthless math of public markets and the very visible collapse of the SPAC fantasies, funds want near-term revenue logic. Who pays, how much, how often, and without assuming that selling anonymized DNA to a pharmaceutical giant will save the day. Regulators are evolving just as quickly. The FDA's crackdown on health reports, the public outrage over surprise data sharing, the slow drip of genetic privacy laws in states and abroad, all point in one direction. It's an example of what happens when a frontier technology collides with old rules. The next generation will not get the same freedom 23andMe enjoyed. Expect tighter definitions of what direct-to-consumer can claim, stricter consent for data reuse, harsher penalties when genomes leak. So let me take you back to that tube on the kitchen table. Knowing what you know now, would you still send your DNA to a startup, no matter how compelling the pitch, the branding, the promise of health, wealth, and power over your own biology? There was a time when sending that tube felt futuristic, even rebellious, like sneaking into the back door of a hospital lab and grabbing power that used to belong only to doctors and drug companies. But to understand whether 23andMe was doomed or just early, the story has to zoom out from your kitchen table to the entire system it was trying to hack. Let me take you back to 2006. Facebook was still a college toy, the iPhone didn't exist, and the average person thought genome sounded like a sci-fi weapon, not a consumer product. Public comfort with handing over raw DNA was low. Encryption and privacy tech were immature, and regulators were still guessing how to treat consumer genomics, medical device, entertainment, or something in between. Into that fog walked 23andMe, offering health risk scores and ancestry breakdowns straight to your mailbox. In that world, being too early didn't mean no demand. It meant no clear rules, no shared language for consent, and no real safety net when things went wrong. Then came execution. Because of aggressive marketing of health reports without full FDA clearance, the agency dropped a warning letter in 2013 that froze the company's core product overnight. Years of momentum vanished in a single regulatory punch. Instead of quietly building a stable clinical beachhead, 23andMe leaned into hype, went public through a SPAC at a multi-billion-dollar valuation, and told Wall Street it was both a friendly consumer brand and a hard-nosed B2B data empire. The result was confusion. Was this a wellness gadget, a pharmaceutical pipeline, or a data broker with a smiley logo? When the market finally asked for profits instead of promises, that confusion turned from marketing gloss into financial pain. But there is a darker, more fundamental question. Direct-to-consumer DNA testing at global scale may be structurally at war with robust privacy, clear consent, and sustainable economics. Genomes are permanent, infinitely copyable, and reveal information about your entire family, not just your own life. To make money, 23andMe needed massive datasets and repeat monetization of the same DNA. To protect people, it needed strict limits on reuse and ironclad anonymity. Those goals pull in opposite directions. It's an example of what happens when the raw material of a business is the most intimate data humans possess. Different choices might have bent that arc. Staying private longer could have reduced the pressure for dramatic growth stories and allowed a slower, more clinical model, focusing on narrow, high-value use cases like specific hereditary cancers or rare disease cohorts, might have built a smaller but healthier business, one that charged for outcomes instead of volume. A true data cooperative where customers legally owned and voted on how their genomes were used could have turned subjects into shareholders, trading some short-term wealth for long-term trust. Now, split the screen. On the left, an alternate timeline where 23andMe never becomes a household name, never chases consumer scale, and instead grows into a quiet infrastructure provider, powering hospitals, drug trials, and niche clinics from the shadows, making steady money while most people never learn the brand. On the right, a world where 23andMe never exists at all. Consumer genomics emerges later, slower, shaped by hospital systems and public labs, with fewer glossy ads and far less data concentrated in any one company. Which of those worlds feels safer, and which one was ever truly possible? There was a time when mailing a tube of spit felt futuristic, empowering, even a little glamorous. Celebrity ads, bright colors, promises of health insights, and long-lost cousins. Behind that, though, sat something much quieter and much heavier, a stack of legal documents that most people scrolled past in 8 seconds. Those terms and consents did not just say, "We'll tell you where your family came from." They said the company could use your genetic data for internal research, combine it with survey answers about your life, share it with research partners like drug companies, and keep using a de-identified version even if you later closed your account. Not only were they allowed to sell kits to you, they were allowed to sell insights about you to someone else for years. On paper, it sounded reassuring. The language leaned on phrases like de-identified, aggregate, stripped of personal identifiers. Names gone, email gone, address gone. It read like your DNA was being turned into anonymous statistics, a harmless blur inside a massive dataset. But genetic data does not blur easily. A genome is more like a fingerprint that contains your family tree, your ancestry, and in some cases, rare variants that only a handful of people on Earth carry. As more databases appeared, genealogy sites, medical records, criminal forensics, those anonymous patterns could be linked back. A relative uploads to a public genealogy platform. A police lab uploads crime scene DNA. A researcher cross-references biobank data. Suddenly, the wall between identified and de-identified looks less like a vault and more like a curtain. It's an example of what happens when technical comfort words hide very permanent realities. Then there was the question of time. Consent forms often allowed retention of de-identified genetic data indefinitely. Not for a year, not for the length of your subscription, but for as long as the company, its partners, and downstream archives found it useful. Your physical life might end in 8 or 9 decades. Your digital genome could still be humming along in a server rack, powering a pharmaceutical model or a research paper long after your great-grandchildren are grown. On one side of the screen sat lawyers, regulatory experts, data scientists, people who understood exactly how valuable a 12 million person genetic database could become. On the other side sat ordinary consumers, often in financial pressure or health anxiety, paying holiday sale prices and clicking "I agree" between emails. His story is one of poverty to wealth. This story is one of ignorance to power, a quiet transfer of leverage from millions of individuals into a single corporate empire. So let me take you back to that tiny checkbox. How many other products in your life hide the same asymmetry, only with data that expires, unlike DNA? And what happens when a company built on the most permanent data of all starts to run out of money? That tiny checkbox on a website feels local and harmless. But the reality around it is global and massive, a quiet empire of DNA that makes 23andMe look small. Because 23andMe is just one node. Hospitals are sequencing tumors and newborns, storing genomes alongside medical records. Universities are building research biobanks with hundreds of thousands of samples. Ancestry companies are collecting saliva from entire family trees. And in the background, governments and law enforcement are building their own genetic archives, linking crime scenes to real names and real lives. There was a time when DNA sat in a lab freezer and stayed there. Today, it moves. Data sharing agreements push genetic files from a hospital in Boston to a pharma partner in London to a cloud server in Singapore. A research collaboration means your sample, given to study diabetes, ends up inside a dataset used to model schizophrenia, or drug response, or population migration, far from the original story you thought you were part of. On paper, this sounds scientific, neutral, even at times inspiring, and at times chilling. In practice, it means the most intimate identifier a person has can cross borders faster than a passport, be copied infinitely, and never really come home again. Once a genome leaves its original context, the question quietly flips from who owns this data to who can get away with using it. Law enforcement saw that opportunity early. When investigators used a genealogy database to catch the Golden State Killer, it was hailed as a breakthrough. A decades-old serial predator finally unmasked. But look at how it worked. They did not need his DNA in the system. They needed his relatives. A few distant cousins uploaded their profiles to find more family, and suddenly a suspect who never consented to anything was on a very short list. Because of that success, police began trying the same method on other cold cases, running crime scene DNA against consumer genealogy sites, building family trees, narrowing down suspects by age, location, and gender. It is an example of what happens when a tool sold as entertainment becomes a quiet arm of the state. Some companies pushed back, limiting access. Others cooperated, often quietly. The average customer, meanwhile, was still just excited to learn they were 2% something. Let me take you back to the risks that have not gone mainstream yet. Genetic information can hint at disease risk, mental health vulnerabilities, even how a person metabolizes certain drugs. In the right hands, that can save a life. In the wrong hands, it can price an insurance policy, screen a job applicant, or flag a dissident. In a less democratic regime, the same web of databases that helps match donors to patients could help match DNA to protest footage. Pattern interrupt. Pull back from the single spit kit on a kitchen table. Fade the scene until the plastic tube is just a bright dot. Then zoom out to a world map, lit with thousands of pulsing nodes. Hospitals, ancestry firms, police labs, research centers, all separate, all connected, all trading in the same permanent currency. And somewhere in that glowing network, a viewer's own family line is already woven in. There was a time when mailing your DNA felt like mailing a birthday card. Harmless, fun, a little moment in the life of your family. Now, after seeing an empire built on spit kits and uncertainty, that little tube looks more like a contract. So how should someone think about their own data in this world of glowing nodes? Start with a ruthless little checklist. What is the story you hope to buy? Ancestry curiosities? Health risk clues? The feel-good idea of helping research? Then, on the other side of the ledger, what are you actually willing to risk? Privacy, future misuse, the quiet chance that a breach turns your genome into someone else's business model. Not in theory, but in money, in power, in the way insurers, employers, and even governments might behave decades from now. The gain side can be real. A person might learn about a BRCA mutation and push their doctor for early screening. Another might discover unknown relatives and finally map a branch of the family tree that had been cut off by war, adoption, or poverty. Millions are now enrolled in drug discovery projects that could one day save lives, at times inspiring and at times chilling when the same data that flags a disease risk also becomes a corporate asset to be traded. But the risk side is permanent. A password can be changed. A genome cannot. When a company says data is de-identified, remember that genetic code is a name tag that never comes off. It's an example of what happens when the most intimate part of a person's biology is treated like a login that can be copied, sold, and subpoenaed. Before anyone sends a sample to any provider, clinical or recreational, there are questions that should be non-negotiable. How is the data stored? Encrypted on isolated servers or floating through third-party vendors? Who can access it today? Only the company, approved researchers, or law enforcement with a warrant. What happens if the firm is sold, merges, or goes bankrupt? Does the data go with it as part of the assets? And if someone changes their mind, can consent be withdrawn, the sample destroyed, and future research use cut off? Or does withdraw only apply to marketing emails? There are alternatives, and the difference matters. Clinical genetic testing ordered through a doctor often sits inside a stricter legal cage with medical privacy laws, genetic non-discrimination rules, and institutional review boards watching. Recreational tests live in a looser world, optimized for curiosity, growth, and viral marketing. One is built around the medical chart, the other is built around the consumer profile. Yet even no decision is still a decision. A person can refuse every test and still find that a sibling, a cousin, or a distant relative has uploaded their DNA, sketching out half of that person's genetic profile by proxy. Police have already solved crimes this way. So has the advertising industry, one quiet database at a time. So let me take you back to that kitchen table, that single tube, that moment before the mailman arrives. After everything in this story, does dropping DNA into the system feel inevitable, empowering, or reckless? Viewers are invited to pause right now and decide whether this empire's rise and fall has changed their own willingness to ever seal that envelope. There was a time when 23andMe looked like pure empowerment. Spit in a tube, learn your secrets, take control of your health and your family story. But underneath that sleek promise sat the central paradox of the entire empire. To give individuals power over their DNA, the company had to quietly turn those same individuals into the raw material of its own survival. Because the tests were cheap, heavily subsidized, and endlessly marketed, millions joined. The money, though, was never really in the $99 kit. It was in what came after. Each sample, each consent box ticked, each relative linked into a sprawling tree turned human life into rows in a database, a potential asset to be licensed, modeled, and sold. Empowerment on the surface, extraction underneath. At times inspiring and at times chilling. Seen from one angle, the story is genuinely impressive. A niche scientific tool turned into a household product. Grandparents comparing ancestry percentages at Thanksgiving. Doctors, for the first time, staring at population-scale genetics from outside a government program. 23andMe dragged complex science into the living room and made it feel as casual as ordering takeout. That matters. Seen from another angle, the same story is a warning. A health company that could not live on health reports. A consumer brand that could not live on consumers. When the FDA yanked away disease risk reports, the business model collapsed so quickly that the real engine came into view. Pharma partnerships, drug discovery bets, and the long, slow hope that enough data might someday turn into enough money to justify the losses. And this is where 23andMe stops being an outlier and starts looking like Silicon Valley tradition. There was a time when free email, free maps, free social networks felt like gifts. Then it became clear the product was attention, behavior, location. Here, the product was genomes. It's an example of what happens when the default assumption in tech is that any intimate record, once digitized, will eventually be treated as inventory. Good intentions did exist. The founders talked about prevention, about giving people leverage over disease, about changing how medicine works. But good intentions are weak currency against investors demanding growth, regulators pulling revenue, and a public trained to expect everything for almost nothing. Under that pressure, even a mission built on personal agency can twist until the data matters more than the person who produced it. So let me take you back to that early footage. Bright offices, excited scientists, a founder promising a new era of personal health. Freeze on the optimism. Cut hard to an empty lab bench, idle sequencers, and silent servers holding millions of abandoned profiles. The vision is still there, trapped in code and contracts. But the empire that tried to own it is fading. In that gap between what 23andMe wanted to be and what it finally became sits the real lesson about ambition, data, and the cost of not knowing how you're going to make money until after you have everyone's DNA. That gap between vision and reality at 23andMe is not unique. It's just unusually visible. The lab coats, the sequencers, the talk of curing disease made it feel noble, almost destined. But under the microscope, this is a story about data, money, and what happens when a company collects the most intimate details of your life long before it knows how to turn them into profit. Because DNA feels exotic, people forget it sits in the same family as other sensitive signals. Location trails that quietly record every night at a partner's house or every visit to a clinic. Face scans that unlock your phone, your bank, your home. Financial transactions that reveal addictions, debts, and secret gifts to someone outside the family. Late-night messages that sketch out a private emotional life far more honest than anything said out loud. All of it is less permanent than DNA, but together it can be just as revealing, just as dangerous in the wrong empire's hands. There was a time when founders could wave a phone around, say, "We'll be data-driven," and investors would nod as if that phrase alone guaranteed future wealth. So products launched first. Free VPNs, calorie trackers, period apps, smart cameras, budget tools. The business model came later, under pressure. And when growth slowed and the runway shrank, the same pattern appeared again and again. If the subscription money wasn't enough, the real money had to come from the data. It's an example of what happens when a company promises convenience on the surface while quietly pitching surveillance in the boardroom. Location apps that start selling anonymized movement data to brokers. Biometric lock screens that quietly improve facial recognition models for third parties. Free finance dashboards that scrape every transaction to build profiles for lenders and advertisers. Messaging platforms that swear the messages are private while mining everything around them. Contacts, metadata, behavior. The product is friendly. The incentives behind it are, at times inspiring and at times chilling. The red flags are rarely subtle, just easy to ignore. Vague privacy policies that talk about sharing with trusted partners without naming them. Heavy discounts on hardware that makes no sense on its own. Smart doorbells, connected scales, always-on microphones that somehow cost less than a dinner out. Pitch decks that lean on phrases like future monetization, data, exhaust, and unlocking new revenue streams, which is a polite way of saying, let us take everything now and figure out how to sell it later. 23andMe is extreme because DNA is permanent. You can change your password, move cities, close a bank account, even rebuild a shattered reputation. You cannot swap out your genome. But the underlying engine that drove its rise and collapse is the same engine humming under much of consumer tech. Gather first, explain later, monetize hardest when the pressure finally hits. So let me take you back to your own phone for a moment. Which apps know the most about your body, your movements, your secrets, your money? And do those companies truly have a clear, sustainable, transparent business model? Or are they still waiting to figure it out with your data? There was a time when the danger felt abstract, a distant future where some faceless insurer might weaponize your genome. Then 23andMe lost control of millions of accounts, and suddenly the future moved in next door. So if your saliva is already in a freezer somewhere, what power do you still have? More than it feels. You cannot unsend your DNA, but you can still control the account wrapped around it. That means locking down logins, forcing two-factor authentication, changing reused passwords that also guard your email, bank, or social media. It also means going line by line through privacy settings, whether your profile shows up to genetic relatives, whether your name or photo is attached, whether your data is used in research, and whether it can be shared with outside partners trying to build their own little empire of health data. Because of how these services are designed, the default is often oversharing. Opted in to research, opted in to relative matching, opted in to marketing emails that gently encourage you to give just a little more. Turning those off is not paranoia. It is an example of what happens when a consumer quietly reclaims power that was given away with one enthusiastic click. Then comes the question nobody wants to ask. Can you delete it? On the surface, the answer is comforting. Most companies, including 23andMe, offer account closure. You go into settings, request deletion, confirm via email, and the public-facing profile disappears. Over time, they promise the raw genetic data and saliva sample are destroyed. But buried in the fine print is the part that does not vanish. Any data already bundled into anonymized research, any insights already shared with a pharma partner, any statistical signal baked into a drug discovery pipeline does not get pulled back out. His story is one of permanent footprints. Yours now is too. So the realistic frame is not erasing the past, but limiting the future. You can decline new research consent. You can revoke marketing permissions. You can stop uploading health updates and family history that make your genetic file more valuable than the money you ever paid for the kit. You can close the account entirely and accept that what remains is a frozen snapshot, not a growing, ever richer dossier. Meanwhile, the world around your data keeps moving. Monitoring becomes its own quiet discipline, watching for breach notifications, not just from 23andMe, but from any partner named in their filings. Glancing at headlines about class action lawsuits and settlements, because those are often the only moments when internal practices become public. Checking once or twice a year whether the privacy policy has shifted from reassuring to ambitious in that at times inspiring and at times chilling corporate tone. Underneath all of this is the emotional part no settings page can fix. Some risks cannot be undone. There is grief in realizing that a fun holiday gift may have permanently changed the privacy landscape of your life and your family. But staying frozen in regret hands even more power to the people who built a business on your anxiety. The only way out is forward, to make informed, deliberate choices now, to treat every new consent box as a real decision, not a formality. So let me take you back to something almost boring. A quiet room, a laptop, no ominous music, no swirling graphics of DNA. Just someone slowly scrolling through their account, unchecking boxes, tightening access, closing what no longer needs to exist. The camera lingers on the cursor hovering over saved changes. For a moment, the empire of data shrinks to a single calm click. And then the scene cuts hard, back out to the wider world, where your genome is only one piece of a much larger surveillance puzzle. There was a time when that wider puzzle looked simple. A box in the mail, a tube to spit in, a colorful dashboard promising to unlock the secrets of your life. Behind it stood a young company founded in 2006, flush with Google money, powered by Silicon Valley faith, that enough data, enough scale, would bend biology to its will. Let me take you back to those first $919 kits. They were luxury gadgets for the curious and the wealthy, sold with the language of empowerment and control. Find your ancestry. Optimize your health. Take power back from a medical system that treated you like a statistic. But the numbers never quite worked. The tests were expensive to run, margins were thin, and each new customer added more cost before adding real profit. Then the FDA letter hit in 2013 and snapped the story in half. Overnight, the health reports that made 23andMe exciting were shut down in the US. Years of marketing vanished with a single regulatory warning, exposing a brutal reality. This company had millions of vials of DNA and no clear, sustainable way to turn that into money without crossing lines that made regulators nervous. So the pivot began, quietly, relentlessly. The playful Ancestry commercials stayed on TV, all dancing family reunions and surprise cousins. But the real empire was taking shape somewhere else, in server rooms, in pharma boardrooms, in contracts with companies like GlaxoSmithKline that paid hundreds of millions for access to one of the largest human genetic databases on Earth. The public story was still about family and fun. The internal story was about drug targets, licensing revenue, and survival. Because the business was fragile. Customer growth slowed, privacy concerns rose, costs stayed high. To keep the dream alive, 23andMe rode the SPAC wave in 2021, going public at a multi-billion-dollar valuation, promising a future of personalized medicines and data-driven cures. What followed was layoffs, a collapsing share price, and then the most ominous chapter yet. Data breaches that hinted this mountain of intimate information was not only valuable, but vulnerable. His story is one of ruthless efficiency and monopoly power. 23andMe's is different, at times inspiring and at times chilling for another reason. It's an example of what happens when a company holds your most sensitive data long before it has a coherent business model. The risk doesn't stay on the balance sheet. It spills into your life, your privacy, your future insurability, even your family tree. So the lessons are not abstract. Be skeptical of any data-hungry product that feels cheap or magical without a clear way it makes money. Understand what you are trading when you hand over your genome for a discount and a few charts. And remember that regulation often chases innovation from behind, arriving only after the damage is done. Now the question shifts to you. What did you trade? What would you trade? And where do you draw the line? In the next section, that line gets tested in ways that go far beyond one spit tube on your kitchen table. Now that the trade is on the table, the story shifts from their empire to your kitchen table. This is where the spreadsheets and scandals stop being abstract and turn into a question about your life, your family, and your tolerance for invisible risk. So first, something simple. Have you ever actually done 23andMe, Ancestry, or any of the other spit kits that promise to decode your past for the price of a casual dinner out? Did you mail off that tube, wait for the email, scroll through the charts about Neanderthal variants and distant cousins and feel like you got your money's worth? Or, hearing everything that came after, does it feel at times inspiring and at times chilling to realize your DNA is now part of someone else's balance sheet? There was a time when sending saliva to a startup felt futuristic, almost harmless, like buying a fun gadget. Now imagine a friend turning to you today, tube in hand, asking whether they should do it. No drama, no conspiracy, just a quiet favor. Should I mail my DNA to this company? What would you actually tell them, knowing what you know now about FDA crackdowns, pharma partnerships, layoffs, breaches, and a business model that survived by turning customers into a product? This is where the answers get interesting. Calling it simply good or bad lets the companies off too easily. Because the scientific potential is real. Millions of genomes can reveal disease patterns, drug targets, even ways to drag certain illnesses out of the shadow of poverty and into the light of treatment. But because of the ruthless pressure to make money, that same database can also become a financial asset to be sliced, sold, and leveraged in ways most people never imagined when they clicked "I agree." It's an example of what happens when the lab meets Wall Street and the incentives quietly shift. So consider a different version of this story. Let me take you back to that same friend with the tube. But now the company has a new pitch. Any drug developed using your data, any discovery that turns into real wealth, shares a slice of the profits with you. Not a coupon, not a holiday discount, actual money wired to your account. Would that change your answer? Would that make you more willing to participate? Or would it only confirm that your genome was always an asset waiting to be monetized? Use the comments as a kind of genetic town square. Share the wild branches of your family tree that showed up out of nowhere, the surprise half-sibling, the health report that helped you, or the privacy scare that made you wish you could unspit. Compare notes. Because the next part of this story goes even deeper into what happens when that data leaves the lab and enters markets that do not care whose DNA built the product. Because the next part of this story is not just about 23andMe losing control of a genetic town square, it is about an entire generation of companies that built empires on data they did not fully understand and business models that were never quite real. There was a time when disruptive meant clever software and cheap cloud servers. Now it means handing over a piece of your body, your life, your family, in exchange for a promise and a slick app. 23andMe is only one chapter. His story is one of oil and railroads. Theirs is one of spit kits and sequencers. Different century, same dream. Take something intimate, industrialize it, and hope the money shows up before the regulators, the hackers, or the angry customers do. It is an example of what happens when ambition races ahead and the economic engine is a blank slide in the pitch deck. So let me take you back to the wider landscape this episode belongs to. There are other DNA firms that race to build even bigger databases, health apps that quietly sold anonymous heartbeats and sleep cycles to advertisers, data-hungry consumer platforms that asked for your face, your voice, your location, your contacts, and then swore they would never misuse them. Some promised to cure disease, some promised to improve productivity, many promised to change the world. Most, when the bills arrived, reached for the same solution: turn the user into the product. This channel is following those companies one by one. The next videos go into other biotech and data-driven ventures that looked unstoppable on launch day and then slammed into harsh economic or ethical realities. Startups that went public through flashy SPACs and then watched their valuations evaporate. Platforms that built fortunes on health data, then discovered that regulators and courts read privacy policies very differently from investors. If this story helped make sense of the 23andMe roller coaster, subscribe so you do not miss the next chapters in the series on fragile tech business models. The goal here is not just drama, it is self-defense. Understanding how these business models really work, where the money actually comes from, and who really owns the data is one of the few protections an ordinary person has when facing companies that speak the language of science, but live and die by quarterly earnings. In the comments, say which company or sector should be unpacked next. Another DNA testing firm that emailed you every holiday. A health tracking app that knows your heartbeat better than your doctor. A social platform that trained its algorithms on your face or your voice. Leave the name, leave the story, and it may be the next episode. Because the next time a startup asks for something intimate, your face, your voice, your heartbeat, your genome, you will have this story in the back of your mind before you say yes. And that quiet hesitation might be the most powerful data point you ever create.